Oh, sorry about this, everyone. Phil's sound's not coming through. It was a moment ago, and now it's not. Just 1 second while I try and sort this out, everyone. This is going to be really weird for people watching because I think they can hear me. uh, oh, hang on. Go on. Right.
Right. Are we on? Right. Apparently we're on, but it'll take you 10 seconds to work it out. Right. So I thought we would talk today about the EU Retained Law Act. I've often been calling it the Retained EU Law Bill. In terms of what it is, what it isn't, I'm still going through it. I've spent summer trying to go through bits of it. I'm not a legal expert. I'll just sort of show you what it looks like, because what you ideally want. So for those who don't know, the Retained EU Law Bill, it's now an act, it's now in law, was Jacob Rees-Mogg's idea. He wanted to basically get rid of all our rights and protections. And what he did to do this, he obviously knew the government can't say, oh, we want to abolish all your rights and protections, right? So he says, oh, we need to get rid of all these terrible EU rules. That's why we left the EU, because we don't like these EU rules, even though we came up with most of them and strongly supported and or came up with 98% of them. So, but no, it's all really terrible. So what he did was to come up with this idea of just abolishing all EU era regulations. Anything that came from the EU Parliament, basically, anything at all that came from Brussels and was put on our statute books was to be abolished, including, as I say, workers' rights, civil rights, consumer rights, environmental protection, safety standards, the lot. Now, this would have been utter madness, and we've seen in a story this week that shows how mad it would have been. So what Rishi Sunak did, he says, well, this is clearly bonkers. Now, there was a little period where I actually wondered if he was going to kick the whole thing into the long grass, because he'd got his Windsor Framework win. I thought, well, might we see the Retained EU Law Bill disappear? And it's like, no, he's still gone ahead with it. And but instead of removing thousands of rules, it's removing hundreds, but that's still potentially hundreds of rights and protections. Now, before I go over the one that's really newsworthy this week, which I did do a video on yesterday for those who watch my channel, there are 3 types. Now, I'll show you briefly how the government present them. This is what they look like. It's just a spreadsheet. It's just an Excel spreadsheet with hundreds of EU rules and stuff. Right, I'll come back to that in a moment. So there are 3 types in here. The first are those that are genuinely defunct, right? So there are bits of legislation. In fact, I better put it up just to show you an example of one. So some of them some of it relates to things. I'm not going to find one now because there's hundreds. Some of it relates to things where there was like it was part of a program that's finished, so the law is no longer valid. And you have those. Every legislative body has those in the world. Lee Cruz, £2 super chat. Thank you very much. Says morning and thanks, Phil, for all your work. No problemo. So, for example, I mean, you'll hear every now and then you'll see something online, won't you? You'll see a website. There's these 10 old rules that are still in force in like America or even the UK. It's like, oh, if you stand in a certain place and as an Englishman, you're allowed to shoot a Welshman with a bow and arrow on a Sunday afternoon or something like that. And you go, oh, and this is still legal now. And it's like, no, it's not, is it? Because what happens is when you're like, particularly when you're in an ancient country, obviously there's lots and lots and lots and lots of laws are built up over time. And it's a right. Sorry, you'll hear banging, by the way. We've got someone ripping a toilet out. But you'll hear lots of so there's lots of these laws that don't actually do anything. They're no longer in force. Like you can't shoot a Welshman with a bow and arrow because it's murder, right? So there's so the government are getting rid of a load of these, and you think to yourself, okay, well that's fine. By the way, anything like that, if it has no legal force right now, it doesn't do any harm. But then you think, but why do it, given that we have thousands of laws on our statute books that have no legal power anymore because they've been superseded by other legislation, more recent legislation? I mean, this is what's doing, for example, the DUP's nutting in Northern Ireland. you've got these, you know, they're talking, oh, the active union, we need to put the active union back to how it was in 1800. It's like, well, it's been superseded several times since then. We're not putting it back to how it was 200 odd years ago. Don't be silly. Steve Kirk there, £10 super chat. Thank you very much. Any chance at the end of the stream you can give us a little update on Boris the criminal's phone? Has it finally been given to the crowd? I'm afraid not. I know nothing. As far as I know, until Judge Hallett, KC, orders it to be handed over, because she's had a load of stuff already. She might not be that bothered about getting it all that quickly, as long as she gets it. So until she decides to order it, I think I'll find out. As soon as I find out, I'll let you know. But at the moment, I've had no update on it at all. And bizarrely, Boris Johnson's not answering my call, so I haven't been able to get it from him either. But anyway, so a load of these rules in here say that they're basically defunct anyway. And it's like, so I haven't got a problem with those going. But the question is, what is the point of the bill? What was the point of the retained EU law bill if all it's doing is clearing up some clutter, which we have loads of anyway, in like UK domestic legislation going back centuries? We have that clutter. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't cause any bother. That's not why they're doing it. The second type of thing being removed from here, I'll try and find some examples of this. I've noted some down, are regulations or rules that, again, are defunct. They're genuinely defunct, but they're defunct only as a result of leaving the EU. And these are just reminders of what we've lost. So I'll go to, I've noted down 292. Let's go to 292. Hope no one's got like epilepsy here, because this looks a bit strobic. But 292 was quite an interesting one when I was going. I've been going through these sort of over summer because I'm not a lawyer. I've actually sent off for a book that tells me how they relate to workers' rights, so I'll wait for that. So here it is. Commission delegate decision, blah, 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 amends Directive 2009-42 EC of the European Parliament and Council on statistical returns in respect of carriage of goods and passengers by sea to simplify the data required to be collected. Sounds really boring, right? Sounds incredibly boring. But nonetheless, it's talking about the collection of data, in other words, scrutiny, like matters of public interest. And the reason for revocation that they're given, and you see this in a lot of them, the legislation is unnecessary because it amends a piece of legislation which no longer applies as the UK is not an EU member state. So there's loads of these things where they're saying it's not, and this is a case of how bureaucracy is simplified. So what they're saying now is we've now got more complicated bureaucracy because we're no longer doing things like this. There's one, I'll read out some rather than keep scanning through them. There's one like part 73 is to do with tax havens. So it's like, oh, we don't need to worry about all these collection of information on taxation for tax havens because we're no longer in the EU. So there's several that talk about like tax avoidance and that, oh, we don't need those because we don't care about tax avoidance. There's loads of fishing ones gone. There's loads of things here that are to do with fishing rights for UK fishermen that obviously are now genuinely defunct, but they're defunct because we left the EU. So lots of places where UK fishermen used to be allowed to fish and aren't anymore. So all fishing when it came to Brexit was all about, oh, we should stop the foreign fishermen coming into our water. It's like, yeah, well, what about all the UK fishermen that went to other people's waters? Because I'll tell you something, the foreign fishermen are still in our waters because they have to be. We don't have enough fishermen to fish our waters. Even UK registered vessels, half their crews on average are foreign because we don't have enough British fishermen. We didn't have enough British fishermen to catch our old quotas. We used to have to hire fishermen from like the Philippines to do it, to work on our boats. But now there's UK fishermen not allowed to fish in certain waters. There are in some, but then there's others where they're not. And there's 276 recycling targets. Blurb basically says we're not part of this scheme anymore and we're not doing our own, because there's several of those as well. Several of them justify it by saying, well, this is an EU scheme that we're not part of anymore. And it's like, but we could have been part of it. You just didn't want to be part of it. So there's lots of environmental ones in there, environmental schemes. There's quite a lot of environmental schemes around the world that the EU are championing, like partnerships with developing countries to, because obviously developing countries are the most at risk of creating quite a lot of environmental damage. So the EU's been working with them. So we're not part of it, but there's no suggestion that we're going to do our own thing either. But anyway, I'll go through a few questions before I go into some more of the other bits. Vendetta saying, I'd be bothered about getting it quickly the more time they have to delete shit. Well, this is the thing as well. There's nothing to stop them. I mean, there's hundreds of these things going to disappear overnight at the end of this year. The ones that are defunct aren't a problem, but it's like, because they're defunct, they didn't need to be removed. Like, they haven't produced this bill to get rid of actually defunct rules, because why put the effort in? They're defunct. By definition, if they're defunct, you can just leave them. It doesn't do anything. They're benign. They've done it because they wanted to get rid of ones that aren't defunct. And the big news this week was, it turns out that the government abolished the right for women to demand equal pay for doing the same work as men. Right? They decided to say, no, women will not, as of the 1st of January 2024, as things stand, women will not have the rights to demand equal pay to men for doing the same work. Now, the Conservatives have now realised that getting rid of that was a bit of an own goal, that Labour will absolutely go to town on that, because Labour are, of course, already promising to any workers' rights that are lost in this, they will be reinstating rather quickly. And this is a big one, because like equal pay for women is like half the population, roughly. Certainly even half their voters. So yeah, they've now said, oh, we're going to put it back. Sorry. But then there's two things about that. It's like, first of all, that means you are removing things with this that aren't defunct. You are removing actual existing rights. Secondly, it means you weren't like being very careful about which ones you're chopping. So how do we know you're not chopping any others that you shouldn't be chopping, type of thing? Because someone chose to do that, by the way. This is very selective. Tinkernator saying there, £10 super chat, thank you very much. The fundamental problem with politics at the moment is the right are disintegrating, centrists are in denial, the left are nowhere. Well, I mean, politics is all about factions, unfortunately. I really can't be doing with it, but unfortunately in politics you have to form alliances. So I can't say I'm not dealing with anyone who's tribal, because then you're left with because that's being tribal itself. You're left with no one. But people are too tribal. And there's too many people, and this applies, like, most famously, I suppose, over the last few years, the hard left in Labour, but it applies to centrists as well. There's like groups all over on the left or around the centre that are attacking each other, sometimes with more venom than people on the far right, who are the actual enemies of everything. But I don't know that it's necessarily true to say the right are disintegrating, though. I would like it if they were. I don't think they are. I think the Conservative Party are disintegrating at the moment. The right aren't. The right are actually getting more organised. I mean, look at what the right wing have done in the last 10 years. They've delivered Brexit. And look at what they're trying to do now. Get us to leave the Council of Europe. In other words, abolish. Their enemy now is the European Convention on Human Rights. They want to abolish all human rights in this country. And you can think about it as, well, they're out on their arse. Labour are coming in, so we're safe now. But it's like, yeah, but for how long? Because they're not going to let this idea go, because they want it. It's nothing to do with asylum either. They know it's nothing to do with asylum. It's our rights. They wanted us to leave the EU to get rid of our rights, to make it easier for them to squeeze money out of us. They now want us to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, which basically means you leaving the Council of Europe, because, again, it represents international standards. They can't change international standards. They can power a government to change domestic law. They cannot change international law. So what do? They want to pull the country out of legal international legal obligations. So I don't think the right are disintegrating. They're actually becoming much more organized. Take, for example, that recent, what was it, the National Conservatism Conference a few months ago. Was it May? Something like that. And it's basically an American group of nutters, but they hold it in Europe and they move it into different parts of Europe. A few years ago, a Tory MP was basically disciplined by their party for attending it in Italy. It was when it was in Italy, right? Now you had a member of the cabinet speaking at it. It's now mainstream. This thing that a few years ago the Conservative Party disowned, now Conservative MPs, including members of the Conservative government, are attending and speaking in. It's so the right are not disintegrating. I have to disagree with that one. I think the Conservative Party are disintegrating, but they, just like Labour are not the left, they're a big part of the left. They're basically the left's representation in Parliament. The Conservatives are not the right. They are just the political wing of the right, but they are not the right. The right are, I think they're much more organized than they used to be. I think it's a real worry. But anyway, I mean, disintegration as in infight and the degeneration of democratic values. Most Conservative voters respect democracy, not Tory members, though. No, well, again, I think the people who drive, because the thing is, like, and I know this is my view, but I really don't think, if I sit down with anyone who believes in like conservative policies, if I sit down with them and discuss them, I don't think anyone will really actually approve of right-wing policies for themselves, because they don't help people. They help a tiny number of very wealthy, very powerful people. It's a tiny number. It really doesn't help anyone, any normal people. Does anyone think the Tories will change the law to stop Britain having an election? I did worry about it. Well, not for the next election now. I did genuinely worry about it at one after 2019. If Labour could not have got themselves into a winning position, I was actually worried. I was worried if the Conservatives won one more election, that could be it. And it sounds dramatic, but it's like, you know, it's happened so many times in modern history in Europe. European countries, developed countries, advanced countries with advanced civilizations and advanced governments all fell foul to fascism. And, you know, you cannot ever allow yourself to think, oh, but it couldn't happen here. Of course it could happen here. If it could happen in Italy, if it could happen in Spain, if it could happen in Germany, if it could happen in Greece, it can happen anywhere. It can certainly happen in the UK. So it's, yeah, and I was really worried. I'm now less worried, but I still worry for the future. We haven't permanently defeated it. Just like when Trump lost the last presidential election and the insurrection was thwarted. America hasn't dodged the bullet. It's dodged one. There's more coming its way. The danger is still there. And the danger is still there for us, even when Labour win next year. What's the likelihood of Labour getting 450 plus seats after EU laws have been scrapped? I don't know. Right. So Labour, I think, should make a great deal of the environmental and workers' protections that the Tories are removing. The workers' rights especially are a very good one for them, because they are promising to reinstate them really very quickly. So because it's going to form part of their manifesto, it makes sense to plug the fact. I mean, it's basically a policy that only exists because the Tories have removed them. There are policies that Labour have to actually just make things better that have got nothing to do with reversing what the Tories have done. But there are policies of reversing what the Tories have done as well. And they're a useful one to get in now and then, because it highlights what the Tories have done, which a lot of people aren't aware of. There's no reporting about, for example, in the Tory client media that I have seen. It might be in the back the arse end of nowhere in the Times or something, but I haven't really. The only mention I saw of removing the right for women to demand equal pay to men for the same work was in the Financial Times, first of all. Then later on, I saw it in The Guardian yesterday. I haven't really seen it anywhere else. Part of me wishes Labour could abolish the Tory party. No, it needs to exist. You need to have everyone's views respected. It just needs to be. You can't allow someone to represent a minority of the people and have 100% of the power. That's really where proportional representation has to come into it. Absolutely where it has to come into it. But there we go. Trump would have made himself president for life. Of course he would. He was already talking about, because Americans have this thing where a president can have 2 terms and then that's it, they go. He was already talking in his first term about, oh, maybe we should not bother doing this. And they have in the past. Roosevelt, for example. So it has been done in the past. And to be honest, I'm not opposed. I don't necessarily, I know some people have different ideas. I'm not necessarily opposed to removing term limits because, like, for example, if there were no term limits, Obama could have stood for a 3rd term and he would have beaten Trump. And then because people focus on the fact, oh, but if we have the term limits, at least if we get a raging nutter like Donald Trump in there limited to 2 terms, it's like, but you also limit it when you actually get someone good. And also a proper nutter will just change the rules anyway. Like, as you say, Trump would have just changed the rules. He would have just changed the convention so that he would have stood a 3rd time and tried to win that. So I don't know that things like that do stop the reprobates. So I would just, and I know, I've grown up in a country that doesn't have these limits. The limits naturally occur because eventually you become unpopular. So the general population naturally deals with you. But there you go. Graham saying they brought in 2 term limits after Roosevelt. I thought they had them before and they were changed or something. But then I know they did bring them in again afterwards, even though he was like a good one. But I'm not, as I say, I'm not in favor because I think a really evil one, it doesn't stop them because they just changed the rules. And yeah, it was a constitutional amendment, I see. Do I think that the high national savings and investment rate, 6.2%, are another problem for future Labour government? Yes. Any high rates are, of course, a problem for the government. Huge problem. It massively limits, basically, it increases the cost of borrowing. And although Labour are having to sort of promise to make sure all their spending plans add up, in reality, they're going to need to borrow for capital investment if they're really going to, get the economy moving. It's yeah, it is going to be a huge problem. Yes, and this is again, the economy is properly knackered. I mean, you can sort of tell how knackered it is by the fact that Labour a few months ago were, their huge part of their election plank, this green investment fund, which is now having to be scaled back. It's not going to be in full in the first year. They're still going to get up there in the first parliament. And that is just because the economy is knackered. And the only way, and the Conservatives keep saying what the problem is. Oh, we need to grow the economy. Yes, we need to grow the economy, but they keep doing all the wrong things. The bottom line is, why is the economy not growing? 2 major problems. First of all, trade barriers that we have erected, but that's not the only thing. The second thing is in infrastructure. Our infrastructure's crap, right? If you're going to boost the economy, you need good quality healthcare. When a worker is ill or injured, they need to be fixed quickly. You need good transport links. You need effective telecommunications. I've had my own problems with that recently. You need a really good education system. And a lot of these things are things that not only take a huge amount of money. Talk about education. So we've got school buildings basically close to collapse now. That is because the Tories have not replaced those buildings. They've come to the end of their natural life and they've not been replaced. Much like hospitals, right? Tory penny pinching. It's like, oh, leave it all for Labour to sort out, just like they had to do last time. But the problem is they've been in power for so long that they are actually about to collapse. And what are they doing about schools collapsing? Oh, we'll teach the kids to evacuate really quickly. That's what they're doing. That's their solution. Shall we actually repair these buildings? No, just teach them how to run really quickly and hope they don't get crushed by falling concrete. Jupp saying there, FDR was not a good one for the rich, though, Phil. Well, again, you know, just the change in American politics since Reagan. Like, Republicans used to tax the rich. The Republican Party, which was always like the right-wing party in America. I mean, they're both sort of right-wing, I think. But, you know, they were the ones furthest to the right. And yet they still taxed the rich. It was Reagan and Thatcher, the combination of Reagan and Thatcher fundamentally changed like what you might call conservative politics in America and the UK, because they both had very different attitudes before. But anyway, Freckle Peony saying the Tories do not need eliminating, however, they do need humbling. Half a generation, if not a full one, out of power should go some way to doing this. The thing is, it didn't work last time. They got more serious about winning the election, but not more humble, because they came straight in and landed us with austerity, which never should have worked. They should have been immediately dumped on their arse in 2015. Unfortunately, they took advantage of the fact that Labour were not. I mean, that was the problem. Labour stopped being serious. They got too complacent. They were winning. Like when Labour won in 2001, not 1997, that's when they came to power. 2001 was the real difference, because that was the first time that Labour had ever properly won a general election from power. Clement Attlee sort of did it, but he was out on his. It was not a functional government. So there was another election later that year and he lost. So 2001 was the first time that Labour won a stable majority, well, a majority at all, from being in power. And then they did it again in 2005, and they just got complacent. And they didn't, even when they lost, you know, they just didn't get serious. But there we go. Phil thinks a group of sociopaths who committed mass murder should have a fair say. Everyone should have a fair say. But they should not be allowed power unless they represent the majority. Because if they represent the majority, then it's down to the population. Like I keep saying, the problems we've got in this country are ultimately down to the Conservatives. But if they were voted in by a majority of the population, I would say, well, it's the public's fault. The public should take responsibility. Now, there are members of the public who voted Conservative who should not have done. Yes, you could say they should take responsibility, but it's not a majority. It's not a majority who voted to leave the EU. It's certainly not a majority who voted to leave under the hard Brexit terms of 2019. It's not a majority who put any government in power, quite frankly. So, you know, we should have proportional representation. Chris was saying there, Telegraph comments out wealth taxes. Reeves, wealth tax is another question. I simply cannot see the difference between Sunak and Reeves anymore, and we know Starmer's an economic novice. It is like, so what people see, for example, I am in favor of a wealth tax, but at the same time, people again are going, oh, they won't do this tax, they won't do that tax. It's politics. It's not economics. It's politics, purely politics. The bottom line is, why do you want a wealth tax? The reason I want a wealth tax is because we need to raise more tax revenues in order to boost the, like, tax revenues will naturally grow if we grow the economy, but you need to, you know, speculate to accumulate, as they say. So you have to invest to get the economy growing. The economy is not going to grow just because Labour, you know, legislate for a few things. Legislation can help a little, but it's not ultimately going to grow the economy. That needs investment. So what do? You need to raise more tax revenues without growing the economy first. And you can't load up more of a tax burden on ordinary working people. So ultimately it has to come from the rich. And you think, well, a wealth tax is one way of doing it. Absolutely. But the bottom line is, are Labour still talking about acquiring more taxes from the rich? Yes, they've got loads of ways they're doing that, mostly by removing tax breaks. So it's really this simple for me. Are Labour going to invest in public services? If they do, then what's the problem? You know, does it matter where they get these taxes from? As long as they're not loading it up on people who already can't afford it, and as long as they're doing it somehow, then it's fine. You know, I don't get fixated on methods. I get fixated on outcomes. Yeah, sorry if you can hear banging. There is a plumber in ripping tiles and toilets out. Unfortunately, I'd completely forgotten about it until they arrived today. Ned saying we haven't had a government elected with a majority in recent history. No, indeed. That's what I mean. You know, so proportional representation. This is why I say proportional representation doesn't just keep the Tories out for longer; it keeps them out forever, effectively, because they're not going to get a majority. They're not. You know, even if you lump up, because they'll split, you'll have like 3 parties on the right. Probably you'll have like the Reform UK, and even the Conservative Party will split itself in 2 eventually. Once it's bedded in, so will Labour. So what we'll end up with is like between 6 and 8 significant political parties in Britain, and coalitions will form from those. And sometimes they'll be unstable. But I'd rather unstable because people won't work together, because then that encourages you to elect political leaders who will work with other parties. Because if you're a member of a party, political party, and you can try and form a coalition with some people to form a government, and your leader has a terrible attitude towards their coalition partners, and that's why they can't form a stable government, then it's not in your interest to keep that leader. So it becomes in your interest to elect political leaders who can do deals. You know, but as I say, it stops anyone, including the Conservatives, coming in having 100% of the power, because there's no other credible party in this country that wants, for example, like, okay, recently, in terms of talking about tax breaks, we've gone over time. Talking about tax breaks, I'm going to do a video on this later on today if I can get time. 10 water companies that have been dumping raw sewage in our waters paid no tax last year. Private water companies dumping untreated sewage paid 0 tax last year. No. It's not just that Labour wouldn't have allowed that, nor would the Lib Dems, nor would the Greens, nor would the SNP, nor would Plaid. Like, there are very few parties in this country that would have allowed that, and there's no majority for any of those at all. He sounds angry. He's a Tory plumber. I actually think he is. I haven't asked him. But anyway, there it is. We'll call it there. Thank you very much for coming on, everyone. Have a great day, and until next time, I'll see you later.